Most young women want to become wives and mothers. Most men, deprived of the maternal instinct, just want a quiet life and an interesting and well-paid job. And unless a Dr. Pontecorvo can find some satisfactory alternative to sex, that's probably how it will be. Now, some women manage to live two lives concurrently, and I have lived, and in spite of retirement, am still enjoying three lives simultaneously. My life as a housewife, a mother, and a grandmother. My life as a Quaker, an old lag, and a highly respected vice chairman of one of Her Majesty's boards of visitors to a Borstal institution. My life as a scientist, all spiced with a generous dose of foreign travel and of public speaking. Sometimes, of course, my lives become a little confused, as when a chairman once introduced me by saying that the fact that I was a fellow of the Royal Society proved that I was a qualified scientist. He could vouch for the fact that I was a qualified Christian. Well, the word qualified has two meanings, and the audience saw it just a split second after I did. Now, let's assume that to be a Fellow of the Royal Society is the hallmark of a well-qualified scientist. There are some 700 fellows, of whom 20 are women. There is one woman foreign member to about nearly 70 men. And the American and the Soviet academies of science have certainly no better a ratio, rather, I think, worse. If this is evidence of discrimination, then, of course, it's very serious. But if, as I think, it is the reflection of scientific achievement and of scientific and professional ambition, then it is at least equally serious in this day and age. Now, why are there so few eminent women scientists? I think I want to go back, at least in the context of the British academic world, to the beginning of the last century. The Royal Institution was founded at a time when science was held in very high regard in the world of scholars. The Royal Society had been in existence for 140 years. And Count Rumford planned to exploit and extend this interest to the fashionable world of men and women in order that he might pay for the training of mechanics and the application of science to the alleviation of the lot of the poor. He therefore encouraged women to become, ladies, I beg their pardon, ladies to become proprietors and life subscribers and annual subscribers, and they would have all privileges except that they would not be asked to undertake the management of the Royal Institution with the officers. But when the first journal of the Royal Institution was published on the 5th of April in 1800, there were 101 lady members. Now, the successors of Count Rumford and his first lecturers and professors were interested in pure science, not science for the poor. But they still wanted the ladies to pay for the pure science and indeed for their own sake. May I have the first slide, please? Thomas Young, who was Professor of Natural Philosophy from 1801 to 1803, was a physician, a physicist, and a linguist, who undertook the lecturing at the Royal Institution in the spare time from his medical duties. It was said that his lectures were condensed and laconic. He advocated the study of science to ladies, females, as a worthy alternative to the insipid consumption of superfluous time. I think that's an admirable description of beauty parlors and bridge parties and bingo or whatever were the occupations of their leisure hours in those days. The ladies certainly came because Lord Brougham, castigating Dr. Young for his temerity in putting forward a wave theory of light, and the Royal Society for publishing it, wrote this in the pages of the Edinburgh Review. It is difficult to deal with an author whose mind is filled with a medium of so fickle and vibratory a nature. Has the Royal Society degraded its publications into bulletins of new and fashionable theories for the ladies of the Royal Institution? Let the professor continue to amuse his audience with an endless variety of such harmless trifles, but in the name of science, let them not find admittance into that venerable repository which contains the works of Newton and Boyle and Cavendish and Maskelyne and Herschel. And this sneer really needled Thomas Young, who replied, whatever may have been the imperfections of my lectures, it cannot be asserted, except perhaps in the Edinburgh Review, that they were fit for audiences of ladies of fashion only. Well, Humphrey Davy also came, can I have the next slide please, in 1801 for a room, coal, candles and 100 guineas a year. He was not condensed and laconic. He was young and gay and enthusiastic, and the audience loved him. The ladies loved him especially. In 1810, he put forward a plan for improving the Royal Institution and for rendering it permanent, and he said, it is not our intention to invite them, that is the ladies, to assist in the laboratories. And he went on, what he wanted to do was to encourage the study of those more elegant departments of science which at once tend to exalt the understanding and purify the heart. The leisure of the higher female classes is so great, he said, and their influence in society is so strong, that it is almost a duty that they should endeavor to awaken and keep alive a love of improvement and instruction. Let them make it disgraceful for men to be ignorant, and ignorance will vanish. And that part of their empire, founded upon mental improvement, will be strengthened and exalted by time, will be untouched by age, will be immortal in its use. And then going on to say how they could influence their sons, he says, how much more efficacious must instruction be when communicated by an object beloved and venerated, and in infancy almost adored, and when, instead of being afforded with an effort of pain and labor, it is carried into the heart by kindness and made delightful by caresses and smiles. Wasn't that lovely? Well, it wasn't only the ladies of the Royal Institution who liked Humphrey Davy. He was in 1810, the same year, invited by the Dublin Society to repeat a course of lectures that he gave on the application of chemistry to agricultural science in Dublin. And he was paid 500 guineas for it, 6 lectures. And there must have been probably women landowners in his audience who did apply chemistry to their agriculture. Certainly there must have been ladies there, because when he gave the next series in Dublin in 1811 on chemistry and on geology, his first lecture was on the fitness of science to improve the female character. And he wrote and told his mother with delight that 550 tickets had been sold at 2 guineas each, and they were changing hands at 10 to 20 guineas. Quite a black market. And he got £750. Now, when you think of the change in the value of money from then until now, £750 for courses of lectures that he'd given before, It was really... Well, this is what he said. In this room, I am sure I need not enter into any elaborate arguments in favor of a certain acquaintance with the philosophy of nature in the system of improvement of the female mind. The same reasoning would, I conceive, apply in this case as to the study of the mathematics as part of the education of the other sex. So he evidently didn't suggest that women should study mathematics. Then he went on, by accustoming the mind to strict reasoning and minute observation as to matters of fact, the judgment is strengthened and rendered more acute and distinct in its application to common affairs. Unhealthy sensibilities are destroyed and the imagination refined and exalted. This he followed up with a few snide remarks about Milton, whom he described as being not distinguished either for his respect, his attention, or his attachment to the softer sex. And then he went on, the standard of the consideration and importance of females in society is, I believe, likewise the standard of civilization. The diffusion of knowledge is the lamp which guides our steps amid the obscurity of things, affording a noble employment in youth, a delightful consolation in age. Now, stripped of his eloquence, I think he gives two good reasons there why girls should study science. It's an excellent training for the mind, and it is, or may be, a noble and delightful occupation. But there is a third reason, and that is that no nation wanting a decent standard of living for all its people can afford to neglect half the potential ability of its people. It would be like an engine firing on half its cylinders. And this doesn't apply, of course, only to Britain. It applies very much so to those developing nations that are attempting to pull themselves up by their own shoestrings and that are suffering a brain drain. In fact, if the United States of America were to use its own woman power, it might not be necessary for it to drain the brains from other countries. And if we used our own women doctors and trained more, it might not be necessary for us to import medical men from India and Pakistan, where they are certainly more needed than they are here. Heads of schools tell me that it's exceedingly difficult to find a place for even an intelligent girl in a medical school. If she wants to become a doctor, they have to discourage them very often because of the sheer difficulty of finding them a place. Well, early in the 19th century, there was a brain drain, but it was a drain from Britain to the continent. And the British Association for the Advancement of Science was founded to combat this tendency and also to draw the attention of the government and other patrons to the need for encouraging science and scientists, but not women scientists. Men only were invited to the first meeting in York in 1831. There was quite a serious debate as to whether ladies might be invited at least to the social occasions on successive meetings, if not to listen to the lectures. And the president-elect, the Reverend William Buckland, wrote to his friend Murchison, "Everybody whom I spoke to on the subject agreed that if the meeting is to be of scientific utility, ladies ought not to attend the reading of the papers, especially in a place like Oxford." As it would at once turn the thing into a sort of Albemarle dilettante meeting. Well, apparently not only Oxford, but also Cambridge, Edinburgh, Dublin of all places, Bristol and Liverpool were unfit for ladies to be invited. But in 1838, Newcastle on Tyne was all right. And 1,100 women came as compared with 1,300 men. You'll find in the library, I think, one of the tables showing the relative numbers of men and women at the various BA meetings from the beginning. But they weren't allowed to attend the papers in the section on zoology because of the nature of some of the papers given. Well, of course, I at once went to look at the program and see what was so unfit, but you know, I couldn't find anything. There was one paper on the 2 sexes of a rare insect. There was one, I think it must have been this, on the reproductive economy of kangaroos. There was another on the wild cattle of Chillingham Park, and of course wild cattle include bulls with not very nice, well, anyhow. The ladies were evidently upsetting at that meeting because they banned them from the next 2. And they didn't come again, and then in very much smaller numbers, until the BA met in Plymouth in 1842. But that meeting was notable because Mrs. Davis Gilbert, a woman landowner near Brighton, gave the first of 4 papers in successive years, the first on agricultural education. She had invented a kind of sandwich course for her tenants' children. And small holdings, which she encouraged and which she found much more profitable than letting the land out in large quantities, and intensive agriculture of the land. She obviously used scientific methods. She exhibited some of her own wheat. But papers by women were rather few and far between. In 1855, Lady Bentham gave a paper on an improved mode of keeping accounts in our national establishments. I can't help feeling that she and Mrs. Barbara Castle would have a lot to say to each other. And then about 100 years ago, Miss Lydia Becker gave a succession of 5 papers, but the one she gave in 1868 was on some supposed differences in the minds of men and women with regard to educational necessities. And she suggested to the section on economic science and statistics that they should consider, 1, that the attributes of sex do not apply, do not extend to the mind. 2, that any broad marks of distinction are fairly traceable to the influence of the different circumstances in which they pass their lives. And 3, that the tone of mind, habits of thought, and opinions of men and women do not differ more among persons of opposite sexes than they do among persons of the same. Well, and then she and some other ladies went on to ask the council whether ladies would be eligible to committees and other offices of the BA. Dear Miss Becker, she didn't get much change out of the council of those days. It was 44 years before Miss Ethel Sargent became president of a section of the British Association, and I hope that Miss Becker was looking out of a window in heaven when Miss Saunders of Newnham became a member of the council in 1914, and 54 years later when I became President Dundee. I must add, I think that I met no prejudice or opposition whatever. Well, now, what of the universities? As far as I can find out, Oberlin College, Ohio, which was founded in 1833, was the first, and from the very beginning opened its lectures, its examinations, and its degrees to men and women alike, and very shortly afterwards to all races alike. That was not the case for the British universities, and here I owe a good deal to a lecture that Dr. Dunsheath gave to Convocation at their centenary celebration. In the middle of last century, there were 50 institutions of London University, and they declared that they were not empowered to admit females. But in 1863, the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science arranged that 83 girls should take the Cambridge local examination papers, and that the examiner should mark them on the side, as it were. And then they discussed the results. One physiologist said that although it was a disputed point whether the female brain was capable of the same power of thought as the male brain, he was convinced that there would be less illness among women of the upper classes if their brains were regularly and systematically exercised. Another expert assured the meeting that if girls are encouraged to use their brains, the excitement would not produce insanity. And a third said that girls at a village school who'd been taught botany by a university professor were in special request as nursery maids. There was one adverse criticism of the girls' scripts. The secretary of the association reported that they often answered with great pains and correctness not the question set, but some other on the same subject. Well, we've all met men students who did that too. Anyhow, in 1867, the University of London did get a supplementary charter to admit women to examinations, although not to degrees, a special examination, and to their great surprise, they found that they did best in classics, mathematics, and science. Not at all what they'd expected. But mind you, some famous girls' schools and colleges had been founded about that time. Girton College celebrated its centenary last year. But in 1877, when Sir William Bragg was a boy of 15, there was a new Act of Parliament which allowed all universities to open their degrees in medicine to women, and the next year, the University of London opened all its degrees to women. And in that respect, it was, according to Liesner Meitner, 30 years ahead of the German universities. They didn't open their degrees until, well, within my own lifetime. Now about the Zoological Society, the learned societies. Zoological Society, 1829, the Royal Entomological Society, 1833. These admitted women from the time of their incorporation. But the Royal Society not until 1945. You'll see an account of the admission of women there in the library. The Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919 removed all legal barriers to anybody having a royal charter. But of course, to become a fellow, you must be nominated. And no woman was nominated for another 25 years. In 1944, Sir Henry Dale, the president, arranged for a referendum, a written referendum during the war, of the fellows to find out whether they were willing for women to be admitted, and 90% were in favor. I think that's pretty good. I would say that perhaps the 10% remaining is a measure of prejudice and discrimination in the British academic world today, perhaps. 2 women were admitted in 1945, and 1 or none every year since then, as compared with 25 to 35 men. And in the 1969 ICSU yearbook, that is the yearbook of the International Council of Scientific Unions, to which 90 countries adhere, there are 721 officers and members of committees, of whom 11 are women. No, 10. 10 are women. 4 from France, 3 from Britain, 1 from the Netherlands, 1 from the United States, 1 from the Soviet Union. The distribution varies, the number remains about the same. In the applied science, there are even fewer. Other countries do have more than we have. The next slide, please. Here you see the percentage of women in engineering in a number of different countries. I'm sure some of these will surprise you. I can vouch for the fact that when I went to the Soviet Union in 1966 for the International Union of Crystallographic Congress, there were a great many women working in the laboratories, but all, or practically all, in the lowest grades. And that is the pattern, that women are in the lower grade scientific and technical jobs, very few at top level. Now, I think before we can consider why, I'd like to show you some of the statistics, the examination results. The next slide, please. Now, here you see the distribution of the first degree graduates among various subjects. You'll notice that pure science, there are far more men than there are women. This is the men, women, about a quarter. Applied science, here's the men, and women right down here. Arts, not very much difference. I should perhaps say that under the University Grants Committee classification, applied science includes engineering, technology, agriculture, forestry, architecture, and town and country planning. They're all included. Not medicine. Now let's, next slide please, take a step backwards. Here you have some of the results, very much selected of course, for the O level and the A level of the School Certificate of Education. The data here are at a time when I was making something of a study of these, but they haven't really changed very much. I have here the Associated Examining Board's data for 1968, and I can supplement this by saying that there are now not quite so many girls who take religious knowledge as compared with boys. They still do very much better. You notice that the girls do better in the physics with chemistry than the boys do, which is an indication, I think, that many of these girls who took physics with chemistry, which is the easier option, could have taken the stiffer papers. And the same is true of general science. Biology is interesting because more girls took biology at the O level, and in fact, human biology, 7 girls take to every 1 boy. But when you get to the advanced level, there are more boys than girls. And the ratio of the science and mathematics is steadily going down. For cookery, which I haven't included here, there are 80 girls to every 1 boy, but for geometrical drawing, there are 90 boys to every 1 girl. And in fact, very few women take engineering today, in spite of the encouragement that has been given them by the formation of the Women's Engineering Society 50 years ago, and its daughter body, the Electrical Association for Women, under the inspired leadership of Dame Carolyn Hazlitt. The next slide, please. I don't know whether Lord Jackson will recognize these figures, but they were given by him. I've taken them from a table he gave in a lecture some 12 years ago. But again, the figure has changed very little. Approximately the same number for arts, much less for science, and hardly any girls at all taking technology. In fact, I got the figures from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. Their corporate members, which includes fellows and members entitled to put MIME after their name, 44,000 men, 14 women. Institution of Civil Engineers, nearly 26,000 men, 7 women. The next slide, please. Now, this shows you the way in which first-degree graduates are distributed among further study or immediate employment or training. A lot of the men go into immediate employment, but the number who go for further study, which is this full curve, is much more than of the women. About the same number go for teacher training. That's the dotted line in each case. The next slide shows the way in which the employment, immediate employment, is distributed. As I said, a great many men go into industry or commerce at once after their first degree, but about 1,000 a year go directly into education without training. You see, in the last graph you saw those who were going for training in teaching. These are those who go directly into teaching without further training. And I wouldn't mind hazarding that that includes a great many of those who do teach mathematics and science because they can so easily get jobs. Where you see that about a quarter of the number of those who take science are women, that includes an average of 8% for the physical sciences, about 17% for mathematics, and 32% for biology. Rather a widespread, but a good many more women do take biology at degree level than the physical sciences. These figures haven't changed very much in Britain, and in that respect we're more fortunate than in America, where the figures are actually going down. They're certainly going down on a relative scale, and in point of fact, the actual numbers of women chemists, geologists, and geophysicists is decreasing in the census data for 1960 as compared with 1950. I should be very interested to see what 1970 brings forward. The next slide, please. Now, this slide I find very depressing indeed. This shows the distribution of higher degree graduates among the different fields of study. And you see here's pure science for the men and applied science for the men, and very few women taking any higher degrees at all. And the next slide, which shows you the data for one of the new universities, the University of Essex. I want you to look particularly here. These are the undergraduate, 18 women in the physical sciences as compared with 234 men. These are the registered students for 1969 to 70. No women as compared with 80 men. So the modern universities are no better than the more established ones. Well, the higher you go, the smaller the proportion of women relative to men. This applies to all subjects, but especially to science. The next slide, I show the percentage of women in the boards of studies of the University of London in the calendar for 1967 to 8. The boards of studies consist of the senior members of the academic staff, the professors and the readers in all the colleges of London University. There was nobody in engineering, and the percentage, that means that there were about 9 or 10 women in physical sciences and so on. I'm not complaining here, I'm simply giving these as a statement of fact. And it's the same in the United States of America in 1962, are the figures that I have. There were 16% women instructors, 10% assistant and associate professors, 5% full professors, but only 1% in the physical, biological, and social sciences. Well, to sum up this part. At the school leaving examination stage, girls are already beginning to avoid science. More so at the advanced level, especially for the physical sciences, and more especially for the practical subjects. And they don't go in for advanced sandwich courses or part-time courses at all, very little. But the more creative, the more responsible the job, the smaller the percentage of women. Now, in 1956, there was a government report on technical education, and this is what it said. A great many girls do not see the point of further education. Their hopes are naturally bent on marriage, and they fear perhaps, although there's much experience to prove them wrong, that by aiming at a certificate, they may miss a husband. Well, I think it's true to say that the more educated the girl becomes, the more selective she becomes. And certainly to have a successful home life, and particularly if you want to combine a family and a career, the most important thing is to choose the right husband, as I did. And nowadays, girls needn't be in a hurry because for the first time for 50 years, there are more young men than there are young women. But it is a natural desire to marry and to have children. But this doesn't explain why girls avoid science even when they're continuing their education. There are, I think, a number of reasons, some valid and some not, but before I go into those, I'll show you a few more graphs. The next slide, please. These are from the Annual Abstract of Statistics. You'll see a couple of copies in the library, and I find these fascinating reading. In fact, I often read myself to sleep with them. Now, here you'll see the economically active and economically inactive males and females. Economically active is the phrase that they use, which means wage earning. Well, as you see, the number of men is much greater than the number of women for the active ones, and much less until they retire for the inactive ones. And the economically inactive females are obviously those of the marriageable age. The next slide, please. Oh, before, you see that this shaded part represents those who are managers or are foremen or self-employed, much more for the men than for the women. The next slide, please. Now, here you see the same graphs of the economically active ones, but emphasizing the part-time workers, who are obviously more for the women and only come into play for the men when they retire. Now, on the next slide, I've shown the same graph for women only, for the economically inactive here and active here, as against the marital status. Of course, they're all single to begin with, and then you get them beginning to marry. This is the marriage curve, and these are widowed and divorced. And you can see from this that a large number of the married women are inactive, but not all. There must be at least that proportion who are working outside their homes. And you can see the same thing from this. Even if you suppose that all the single women and all the widows are working actively outside their homes, there must be at least a third of the married women who are also working outside their homes. Now, what kind of work are they doing? I should perhaps say that it's often taken for granted that it's natural for a woman to stop at home and look after her husband and her house and her children if she has any. But actually, this is a modern phenomenon. It's a direct result of the technological age. Only a highly economically developed country can afford a full-time housekeeper for every working man. Of course, the ladies in novels didn't work, and probably the ladies of the Royal Institution didn't work. But most women, married or single, worked in fields or factories until quite recently, either with their babies on their backs or with their children by their sides. And this point was very strongly made in a symposium held in America in 1965 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on American women in science and engineering. Now, the next slide shows you the average earnings of men and women, first of all in the administrative, technical, and clerical workers and manual workers from 1959 to 1966, that is before the Prices and Incomes Act, but it doesn't change very much. You can see the result of inflation, of course, but you see that right throughout, the wages of women are about half those of men. And this is on a full-time basis, not part-time basis. And the point is not that women are paid less than men for the same job. Sometimes they may be. They also do work a slightly shorter working week, but that doesn't account for so much. What it does mean is that the women are in the lower paid jobs. And why is this? Well, part of it, no doubt, is prejudice and discrimination. That is admitted, for example, in the Fulton Report with regard to the civil service, where it says that women do compete on less than equal terms with men and are usually superior in social and educational background to the men alongside whom they are working. And I think it's generally recognized that if a man and a woman apply for the same job, the woman has to be just that much better than the man to get it. But on the other hand, there are some very good reasons. 90% of women will marry, and they'll have, on the average, 2.2 children each. And 2/3 of them will not want to work outside their homes. Or if they do, there'll be periods when they have to have time off because of babies. Or if their husbands move, they'll want to move with them. And that means that most married women may be inclined to leave their jobs. And it's not every employer that will stand the loss of a key employee, even temporarily. And I think most grant-giving bodies would have to think twice about giving a senior research grant to an engaged girl, though actually the wastage among scientific workers and science teachers through marriage is very small. It's hardly any bigger than the dropouts in the men who change their profession, either because they don't like it or because they're unsuited to it. But the second reason why women accept subordinate positions in science and technology, as well as in any other jobs, is that many of them cannot take more responsibility than they have. To get domestic help now at a price that a young mother can pay is almost impossible, compared with 40 years ago when my first baby was born. Then it was much easier. I was able to give my domestic staff office hours and look after the children myself before 9 and after 5 and at weekends. They weren't at all neglected, but to do 2 jobs simultaneously and well requires stamina and determination and organizing ability, which are not necessarily the qualities of a mathematician or a scientist. And many married and single women have the care of 1 or 2 aged parents. It's very difficult to square the demands of a senior responsible job, evening functions, foreign travel, and certainly an undivided mind with looking after an elderly person or a family. And the family must, and I think should, come first. It doesn't mean that the girl has to scrub and cook and wash, but she must see that these things are done and done well. She must be there when the children really need her, although that may not be quite as often as she thinks. And she must be ready to solve domestic emergencies when they arise. And professional responsibility is just one more load that very often she just can't face. I remember reading a lecture that Sir Lawrence Bragg gave to the Yorkshire Council on Further Education, in which he said that a university professor was like a queen bee, nurtured, tended, cared for, because they only had one function in life, and that was to be a university professor. Nothing could be further from the life of the average professional woman. Well, children grow up and parents die. What then? Next slide, please. An American called Lehman did an investigation as to the time when people in different disciplines did their best and most creative work. And he did this for various sciences and other professions, and I checked it for the sciences and mathematicians by comparing it with the ages at which they were elected to fellowship of the Royal Society, allowing a time lag of about 10 to 15 years between the best work and the election to fellowship. It worked very well. The mathematicians do their best work in the early 20s, the physicists in the late 20s and early 30s, the chemists between 30 and 40, the biologists perhaps between 35 and 50. But you notice that these are just the years in which a woman who is looking after a family is out of action. That means that if she's creative in the family sense, then she has bypassed her creative years in the scientific sense. She will have no publications to her name. If she goes back to work after her family are grown up and no longer need her, she may be able to get retraining. It's unlikely to be adequate, even if it's available, but in any case, it's only likely to qualify her for a subordinate position. She's very unlikely to do creative and original work after that. On the other hand, short absences from work are not necessarily a bar to progress in creative scientific work, and I can guarantee this. I've found it an advantage at times to stand back and look at my work in the context of other disciplines and to find new and allied problems on which to work. And that suggests one way in which any country which wants to use its potential women scientists and technologists could do. I think it's very desirable that such women should have families. Socially desirable. Well, a country makes provision for men who are doing military service in wartime, that they don't lose their jobs, don't lose their status. And is it really utopian to say that a woman qualified as a research scientist or research teacher or mathematics ought perhaps to get 1 year's paid leave for each child as a matter of course, and that universities and local education authorities and other employers might expect to provide nurseries and kindergartens just as they provide refectories or canteens and common rooms? I'm quite sure such facilities would be well used, probably by the young fathers. I have had quite a number of students whose wives were supporting them while they worked, and I'm sure they could have used nurseries and kindergartens. But one thing I am sure of, and that is that women like Professor Dorothy Hodgkin, I must say this, although it may embarrass her, who have won a Nobel Prize for chemistry and yet managed to bring up a family of healthy and intelligent and socially active children, are a tremendous inspiration to other young women. You see, one difficulty is that if very few women reach the top, in physics and chemistry and engineering, then the girls and their parents and teachers think that this is an impossible ambition. I get asked a lot to speech days, and after one speech day to a senior boys' grammar school, I was told one boy said to his father, "She's very small, but she must be awfully tough." But how often are girls who want to be doctors encouraged by their parents or teachers to become dispensers or physiotherapists or nurses instead? They're admirable professions, but if a girl has the ability to become a doctor, then she shouldn't be discouraged by parents or circumstances. I remember nearly 50 years ago, my headmistress, who wanted me to become a mathematician, told me I was a perfect fool to want to take physics because it was a man's field. And with my lack of background of manipulation and skill and knowledge, I couldn't hope to do well in it. In fact, our school had good labs and good science and mathematics teachers, and many girls' schools especially don't. But we can't blame the whole of the shortage on the girls' schools, because it's very much the same story for the co-educational schools. But girls do want a tremendous amount of encouragement. And I'm often asked why women have done so well in X-ray crystallography. I'm quite sure that it was due to the encouragement that Sir William Bragg gave them. The Davy Faraday Laboratory, founded in 1896, did not carry on Humphrey Davy's ban on women in the laboratory. Regulation 3 says, "No person shall be refused admission to the laboratory as a worker or as an assistant to a worker by reason of his or her nationality or sex." And when Sir William came here in 1923, he brought and built up a team of men and women. He established a tradition which I think has been carried on by his students, especially by J.D. Bernal, and I'm glad is carried on today. I think girls need both active encouragement and they need to learn to accept responsibility. I'm personally very sorry for the disappearance of the all-women's colleges in London University for this very reason, that they were an excellent training ground for the capable woman whose natural humility would make her take a back seat in a mixed group of men and women. Now, humility is an excellent quality, but not if it inhibits personal decision-making. And if you're compelled to take administrative duties in a woman's college, you learn to take responsibility. I had an illuminating discussion with some young women in a student's hostel who told me point blank that they didn't want posts of responsibility because it meant that they would be taking decisions which would affect other people's lives. But they were really all mixed up, as a young woman medical student told them, that a medical man or woman has to take decisions which affect other people's lives. They must do the best they can. And when challenged, none of these young women were prepared to say they wouldn't have children, which is a big responsibility. And many of them were training to be teachers. But do women in general have the qualities that make a good scientist? Well, now here again I'm drawing on that MIT symposium. An American woman, Anne Rowe, made a series of studies of eminent physicists and biologists and found 4 factors which were particularly characteristic. First, high intelligence and especially mathematical ability. Secondly, intense channeling of energy in one direction. Most of these scientists were happiest when they were working at their science. Thirdly, extreme independence. They had a few close friends in childhood. They didn't go much for organized group membership. And they had a preference for working on their own, free of all supervision. And fourthly, apartness from others with an extremely low interest in social activities and no sense of guilt at all at wanting to be socially withdrawn. Now, I believe these findings are perfectly true, but if so, it does mean that the present training of girls must be turned almost upside down in order to produce first-class scientists rather than competent and conscientious laboratory assistants. The intelligence is there at the early stage. You can tell that from the GCE results. Of course, not every girl has mathematical ability, but there are a number who do, and the present experimental teaching methods may produce more. But can parents and teachers be made to understand that concentration on a single job, independence of other people, and a preference for social isolation are greatly to be encouraged in any girl of clearly marked mathematical ability? Because these are not the characteristics of the good, sweet, home-loving little girl, nor of the socially successful teenager. Now, if a boy shows a tendency to social withdrawal and solitary pursuits, his parents rejoice, because he's less likely to get into mischief than if he's one of a gang. Any visitor at a Boston institution can tell you that it's the boys who get into gangs that get into trouble, and the only girls who get into trouble are the ones who become part of a boys' gang. But social popularity seems so necessary for a girl that any preference for solitariness is usually worrying. It seems that we have to recognize that there are very few Humphrey Davys who can be both creative and popular. But in a way, all I've said so far has hardly touched the fringe of the problem, which I think is a problem of mankind as a whole. Just 10 years ago, C.P. Snow gave a lecture called The Two Cultures, which achieved such fame that most people have forgotten what it was really about. It was not a plea that those trained in the humanities should have a smattering of science and vice versa. It was a reasoned statement that there are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world and of living in it, the traditionalist and the experimental. Generally speaking, those trained in the humanities are more likely to be the conformists, whereas a scientific training should encourage the questioning of the existing order. Now, women, by and large, are the backbone of the Conservative Party and of the established church. They're not usually the stuff of which pioneers have made. Whether this is a question of training or of disposition, I don't know. I think it's a matter for research. But, unfortunately, science itself is today tending to conform. How many scientists could echo Sir Humphrey Davy when he stoutly defended his right to accept a medal from Napoleon with the words, "If the two countries or governments are at war, men of science are not. That would indeed be civil war of the worst description." John Wren Lewis has suggested in a recent broadcast that unrest amongst our young people is really a manifestation of experimentation as a way of life, in contrast to the habit of conforming to the norm. Even their apparent swing away from and against science is really rebellion against the modern conformism of scientists to the political and social setup within which they work. Conformism with the military-industrial trades union complex about which thinking Americans today, many of them, are so rightly alarmed. It will be tragic if women are attracted to science only when science has become established and conservative. But if a questioning of the established order is the hallmark of the true scientific outlook, then indeed one may expect very few really creative men or women, unless they come from a new generation which has found its way through the present jungle of hippies and beatniks to a new and better experimental way of life. Looking back over a quarter of a century, I sometimes wonder, whether my going to prison as a conscientious objector in 1943 and my election to fellowship of the Royal Society in 1945 were wholly unconnected.